tiny fawn, trembling and alone, waits desperately for a mother who will never return. Days pass, hope fades, and death seems certain for the abandoned baby deer. But in the shadows of the forest, something extraordinary happens. A massive moose, a creature who should be indifferent, makes a decision that defies the laws of nature itself. What unfolds between them isn't just a story of survival, but a reminder that sometimes the most powerful bonds form in the most unexpected places. Spring had arrived in the forest, bringing with it new life that burst forth from every corner of the wilderness. The ancient trees sprouted fresh leaves, wildflowers carpeted the forest floor in vibrant colors, and the air filled with the songs of birds returned from their winter journeys. Among the season's most precious arrivals was a delicate fawn with distinctive white spots that seemed to shimmer like stars against its copper coat. More numerous and brighter than those of other newborns in the herd, its first days were magical. Nursing from its attentive mother, drawing strength from her warmth, learning to stand on impossibly thin, wobbly legs that seemed too fragile to support even its tiny frame. Together, they shared quiet moments as the fawn experienced the gentle touch of sunlight filtering through the canopy, the cool sensation of morning dew against its nose, and the soft whispers of the breeze through the trees. The mother deer was experienced and cautious. She'd raised fawns before and knew the dangers that lurked in even the most peaceful corners of the forest. She chose her resting spots carefully, always with an escape route in mind, always vigilant. She taught her fawn through gentle nudges and quiet signals, when to follow, when to freeze, how to vanish into the dappled shadows of the forest. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, as the fawn learned to recognize its mother's unique scent and the specific sound of her footsteps among all others in the forest. But nature's serenity shattered one crisp morning when the distant crack of rifles echoed through the trees, tearing through the peaceful chorus of birdsong and rustling leaves. The sound was far away, but to the forest creatures, it might as well have been thunder. The mother deer's ears perked up immediately, her body tensed like a coiled spring, and her gentle eyes widened with a primal fear passed down through generations. In an instant, without even a moment's hesitation, she bounded away, her white tail flashing a warning that every forest creature understood: danger, run, survive. The fawn, responding to its deepest instinct, dropped to the ground instantly, perfectly still among the ferns and forest debris, its spotted coat a perfect camouflage against the forest floor. Its tiny heart hammered in its chest, but not a muscle moved. This was the survival strategy imprinted in its DNA. Be invisible, wait for mother's return. Hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. The forest sounds gradually returned to normal, but the fawn remained frozen, exactly as nature had programmed it to do. The warm sun arced across the sky and began its descent, casting long shadows that grew colder as they stretched across the waiting fawn. Then a full day passed. Hunger began to gnaw at its empty stomach. Thirst parched its throat until swallowing became painful. Still, the fawn waited, exactly as its mother had taught it. The instinct to remain hidden warred with the growing need for nourishment only its mother could provide. As the second day dawned, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold that the fawn was too frightened to appreciate, a devastating reality began to sink in, like the morning dew into the soil. The mother who had nursed and protected it, who had been its entire world for its brief existence, would not be coming back. Something terrible had happened beyond the fawn's understanding. Perhaps the hunters had found her, or a predator had seized an opportunity, or she had fled too far to remember the exact location of her hidden baby. The reason didn't matter. The result was the same: complete abandonment. Predators began to circle, sensing vulnerability in the air like a scent. A fox paused, nose lifted, testing the breeze for the telltale smell of a creature in distress. Crows gathered in the branches overhead, their beady eyes missing nothing, waiting for weakness to reveal itself. The fawn's soft cries, tiny bleats that barely carried beyond its hiding spot, went unanswered in the vast, indifferent forest. Each call risked exposing its location, but desperation was beginning to override caution. By the third day, hunger had become a constant, gnawing companion. Thirst had transformed from discomfort to agony. The fawn's once bright eyes, now dull with dehydration. Its once vibrant coat had lost its luster, and the distinctive spots seemed to fade against its dulling fur. Each sound that filtered through the forest, a snapping twig, rustling leaves, the distant call of another deer, brought both hope and terror in equal measure. But the familiar footsteps of its mother never came, and the forest, which had seemed so full of wonder just days before, now felt enormous and threatening. A place of shadows and unseen dangers waiting to pounce. But as the fawn's strength began to fade, its tiny body trembling with weakness and fear, it had no idea that eyes were watching from the shadows. Eyes that belonged to a creature who should have been its enemy. A giant among the forest dwellers whose next decision would defy everything the natural world had come to expect. The fourth day brought a desperate change to the fawn's circumstances. The powerful instinct that had kept it motionless, a survival strategy perfected over thousands of generations, could no longer override the fundamental demands of its failing body. Survival now required movement, a search for sustenance, even if that search exposed it to the countless dangers lurking in the forest. On trembling legs that threatened to buckle with each tentative shift of weight, the fawn rose for the first time since its mother's abrupt disappearance. The world swayed dangerously as it stood, weakened muscles protesting violently after days of enforced stillness. Its first steps were unsteady and painfully deliberate, each movement a monumental effort that sent sharp pangs shooting through its famished body. The simple act of walking, which had been a joyful discovery just days before, had transformed into an agonizing ordeal. Water was the most urgent need, more pressing even than food. The fawn's tissues had begun to shrink from dehydration, its once bright eyes now dull and slightly sunken, its normally moist nose dry and cracked. Somehow, through some combination of luck and the faint, instinctual memory of following its mother through the forest paths, the fawn stumbled upon a shallow stream that cut through a rocky section of the woodland. The sound of water reached its ears before the sight registered, a gentle gurgling that seemed to pull the desperate creature forward with an almost magnetic force. When it finally reached the water's edge, its reflection revealed a stranger, gaunt, dulled, diminished. The cool liquid was life itself as it lapped desperately at the surface, drinking until its shrunken stomach ached with the sudden volume. Small droplets clung to its muzzle as it finally pulled away, momentarily relieved of one critical need. But water alone couldn't sustain its rapidly developing body. Without its mother's rich milk, perfectly formulated to nourish a growing fawn, it needed to learn to forage for vegetation, a skill it was far too young to have mastered. Adult deer spend years learning which plants offer nutrition, which harbor toxins, and which provide medicinal benefits. The fawn had no such knowledge, only the gnawing emptiness in its belly driving it forward. Through painful trial and error, it attempted to mimic what it had observed in its brief life. The selective browsing of its mother, the careful selection of certain leaves while avoiding others. Most plants it tried tasted bitter or strange against its inexperienced tongue. Some made its stomach cramp painfully within minutes of consumption, forcing the fawn to curl up in misery until the discomfort passed. Finding anything truly nutritious was a matter of desperate chance rather than knowledge. It chewed on tender shoots and the softest leaves it could reach, most providing little true sustenance for its growing body. Occasionally, it would discover something palatable: the tender buds of a maple sapling, the soft inner bark of a fallen birch. Small victories in an increasingly desperate battle for survival. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming in those first days of life with its mother as guide and protector, now revealed its harsher nature. Every shadow concealed potential danger. Every unexpected sound sent jolts of adrenaline through the fawn's weakened system. Nights were the worst. Dark hours spent huddled against the base of trees, every snapping twig or distant howl a torment to its frayed nerves. Sleep came in brief, fitful bursts, never deep enough to provide true rest, but sufficient to keep exhaustion temporarily at bay. A small herd of deer passed through the area on the 5th day, their approach announced by the soft sounds of hooves on forest debris and the occasional communication snort between members. The fawn's head lifted instantly, hope flaring in its chest like a sudden flame. Perhaps its mother would be among them, separated but now reunited by fortunate chance. Or perhaps, if that miracle was too much to ask, another doe might take pity on the orphan, allowing it to join the protective circle of the herd, maybe even offering a chance to nurse alongside her own offspring. The fawn summoned what little energy remained in its depleted reserves and moved toward the herd, its step quickening despite the pain of movement. But nature is rarely kind to the abandoned. The laws of survival that govern the wilderness seldom make allowances for compassion. The herd's dominant doe detected the approaching fawn immediately, its scent unfamiliar, its movements betraying weakness. With ears flattened against her skull, she snorted aggressively and stamped a sharp hoof against the forest floor, driving the strange fawn away from her own offspring. When the desperate orphan persisted, approaching from another angle, the doe charged forward several steps, making her rejection unmistakable. The message was clear and cruelly practical. Resources were too precious, predators too numerous to risk accepting an outsider that might attract danger or compete for limited food. Other members of the herd watched with indifference, their own fawns tucked safely behind protective bodies, before the group moved on, leaving the orphan alone once more. This rejection brought a new kind of pain, deeper than hunger or thirst. It was the pain of absolute isolation, of understanding at some primal level that it had been cut off completely from its kind. The fawn retreated to the edges of the forest, where the trees thinned and small patches of meadow offered sparse grazing. Here, at least, it could see danger coming from a greater distance. Though, in its weakened state, seeing predators would hardly help it escape them. The open spaces offered meager comfort, more sunlight to warm its constantly chilled body, occasional patches of clover that provided more nutrition than most forest plants, and the illusion of control in being able to survey its surroundings. The 6th day brought a temporary reprieve. A patch of fallen fruit from a wild apple tree, dropped prematurely by strong winds. The sweet flesh provided more energy than anything the fawn had found since losing its mother. For a few hours after this discovery, its movements became slightly stronger, its eyes a fraction brighter. But this small victory was short-lived. Without consistent nourishment, its body continued its slow decline, each day seeing it grow weaker rather than stronger. as should be the natural progression of a young animal. On the seventh night, a violent storm lashed the forest with unexpected fury. Lightning split the sky in blinding forks of electric blue, and thunder shook the ground beneath the fawn's hooves with such force that it could feel the vibrations travel up through its legs. Rain poured down in blinding sheets, plastering its coat to its increasingly prominent ribs and washing away what little body heat it managed to generate. The temperature dropped sharply with the storm, adding the threat of hypothermia to the fawn's growing list of perils. Seeking shelter from the punishing elements, the fawn darted beneath a fallen log that created a small, relatively dry cavity. But in its haste and the storm's confusion, its leg twisted into a hidden hole, wrenching painfully as it pulled free with a desperate jerk. Though not broken, the injury left the fawn with a pronounced limp, a potentially fatal disadvantage in a world where weakness invited death as surely as blood. In the water attracts sharks. The storm raged through the night, pinning the injured fawn in its inadequate shelter as water eventually began to seep through, leaving it shivering uncontrollably in the darkness. By dawn, the deluge had passed, but its legacy remained in saturated ground, flooded lowlands, and a bone-deep chill that the fawn couldn't shake despite the return of the sun. By the morning of the 8th day, the combination of prolonged hunger, injury, and exposure had taken a devastating toll that could be measured in every aspect of the once vibrant creature. The fawn that had entered the world with such promise was now a shadow of itself, a ghost moving through the forest on borrowed time. Its bright coat had dulled to a lifeless brown, the magical spots that had once seemed to dance across its back now fading like dying stars. Its eyes, once liquid pools reflecting curiosity and innocence, had sunk deep into its skull, giving it the haunted look of a creature already touched by death's hand. The playful bounce that characterized even its earliest steps had been replaced by a halting drag, each movement clearly causing pain as it favored its injured leg. It dragged itself into a small clearing as the morning sun broke through the dissipating clouds. The warmth was a small mercy on its chilled body, and it turned its face upward briefly, as if in gratitude for this final comfort. Too weak to continue its futile search for nourishment, it collapsed among the wildflowers, sides heaving with labored breaths that seemed to take more energy than they provided. A strange calm settled over the fawn, the quiet acceptance that comes when struggle has reached its end and surrender becomes inevitable. Its small body simply had nothing left to give to the fight for survival. In these moments, as consciousness began to waver like a flame in the wind, the fawn's mind filled with fragmented memories of its mother. Her warmth, her scent, the secure feeling of pressing against her side. If death was approaching, at least these comforts would be its final companions. What the fawn couldn't know, as it lay in what it believed would be its final resting place, was that its plaintive cries over the past days had reached the ears of another mother, one who had experienced a loss more devastating than perhaps any other in the forest. And that creature, massive and imposing, was now watching from the shelter of the trees, torn between the immutable laws of nature and something deeper, something that defied explanation but demanded action with increasing urgency. The great animal stood motionless, its breath creating small clouds in the morning air. Its eyes fixed on the dying fawn with an intensity that spoke of internal conflict. Nature dictated one course of action, or more accurately, no action at all. Let the weak perish as they always had and always would. But something else, something that transcended the cold logic of survival, was stirring in the creature's consciousness. A memory of loss, a recognition of suffering that mirrored its own, and perhaps most powerfully, the possibility of redemption through an act that would defy everything the forest had come to expect from its inhabitants. The fawn's breathing grew more shallow with each passing minute. Time was running out. And in the shadows, a decision was being made that would alter the course of both their lives forever. The decision came not in a single moment of clarity, but through a gradual erosion of natural law, a slow-building rebellion against the cold dictates of the wild. The bear, for that was what watched from the shadows with such conflicted intensity, had lost her cubs 3 weeks earlier to the same hunters whose rifles had shattered the forest's peace and separated the fawn from its mother. Her grief had manifested as blind rage initially, a destructive fury that sent smaller creatures fleeing from her path and left trees scarred with the deep gouges of her claws. Then came a hollow emptiness that followed her like a persistent shadow, dulling her normally acute senses and leaving her movements mechanical, devoid of purpose beyond basic survival. Now, watching another mother's child fading away before her eyes, something stirred in her massive chest that defied explanation or categorization within the established order of the wilderness. Perhaps it was recognition of a suffering that mirrored her own. A motherless child, a childless mother, two halves of a broken natural equation. Or perhaps it was something even more profound, a defiance against the cruelty that had taken everything from her, a refusal to allow death another victory in a forest already haunted by too much loss. The massive creature emerged from the tree line with deliberate slowness, her approach surprisingly gentle for an animal of such imposing size and strength. At nearly 400 pounds, the female black bear moved with unexpected grace, each step placed with careful precision, her head low, ears forward in a non-threatening posture that seemed calculated to minimize fear. The fawn, drifting between consciousness and oblivion in its weakened state, was barely aware of the newcomer until a warm, moist breath stirred the fur on its neck, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of predator. Instinct provided one final, desperate surge of adrenaline. The fawn's eyes flew open, pupils dilating with terror as it recognized not just any threat, but perhaps the most dangerous predator these woods harbored. Its body tensed automatically, the flight response triggering in its brain, even as its weakened muscles failed to respond appropriately. But true flight was impossible in its condition. Its weakened body could barely lift its head from the ground, let alone spring up and flee to safety. So it waited for the inevitable end, eyes wide, breath shallow and rapid, heart fluttering like a trapped bird against the cage of its ribs. But death didn't come with the expected swiftness of tooth and claw. Instead, a rough pink tongue began methodically cleaning the dirt and debris from its coat, moving with gentle strokes across its back and sides, just as its mother had done in those first precious days of life. The bear's powerful jaws, capable of crushing bone and tearing flesh with frightening efficiency, instead delivered the gentlest of grooming, removing the accumulated grime of days spent alone and untended. The fawn remained frozen beneath this attention, confusion gradually overriding fear as the massive creature continued this inexplicable behavior that contradicted everything instinct had prepared it to expect. The bear's enormous paws, tipped with claws that could disembowel with a single swipe, now moved with surgeon-like precision to clear debris from around the fawn's resting place, creating a cleaner, more comfortable hollow in the earth. Her movements were careful, deliberate, almost tender, as though she remembered performing these same actions for smaller bodies now lost to her forever. Occasionally, she would pause in her ministrations to sniff the air, her heightened senses alert to any approaching danger that might threaten this fragile creature she had, for reasons beyond natural understanding, decided to protect. When the bear finally moved away, stepping back into the forest with a purposeful stride, The fawn expected abandonment once more. Another brief connection severed, another potential savior vanished. Instead, to its bewilderment, the bear returned shortly with her mouth full of tender vegetation, the exact varieties that adult deer preferred, selected with surprising knowledge of serving dietary needs. She dropped these offerings before the fawn in a small, neat pile, nudging them closer with her blunt nose when the young deer failed to respond immediately. Hunger eventually overcame lingering fear, and the fawn tentatively stretched its neck forward, consuming what was provided with hesitant bites that grew more eager as its empty stomach registered the presence of food. Its body, starved for so long, desperately absorbed the long-absent nutrition, each mouthful seeming to restore a small measure of the strength it had lost. The bear watched this feeding with obvious satisfaction, her small eyes bright with what in any other creature might be called pride. When the fawn had consumed everything offered, she disappeared again, returning this time with water-soaked moss that provided blessed moisture to the dehydrated young deer. The fawn suckled at this natural sponge, drawing out the liquid with increasing vigor, its dulled eyes beginning to show the first glimmers of returning life. For 3 days, this strange ritual continued with increasing confidence on both sides. The bear would leave to forage, her absences growing slightly longer as she ventured further afield to find the most nutritious plants for her adopted charge. She would return with mouthfuls of tender shoots, particular leaves known to be favorites of deer, occasionally even berries that provided concentrated energy. She seemed to understand exactly what the fawn needed, as though accessing some universal knowledge of motherhood that transcended the boundaries between species. The offerings gradually restored the fawn's strength, each meal building upon the last until the young deer could hold its head up consistently, its eyes following the bear's movements with alert interest rather than terror. She slept curled protectively around the smaller creature at night, her massive body providing warmth that chased away the chill that had settled in the fawn's bones during its days of exposure. The first night, the fawn had remained rigid within this furry enclosure, too frightened to truly rest despite its exhaustion. By the third night, it slept deeply, its body pressed trustingly against the bear's side, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of the larger animal's breathing and the security of her vigilant presence. When predators approached, a coyote testing boundaries with cautious circles, a fox too curious for its own good, even a young male cougar passing through the territory. The bear's warning growl sent them scrambling for safer hunting grounds. The message in that deep-throated rumble was unmistakable to any creature with survival instincts. Approach at your peril. This territory, this fawn, were under protection more formidable than any in the forest could challenge. By the 4th day of this improbable arrangement, the fawn could stand steadily again, its legs finding strength that hunger had stolen away. Its coat regained some of its former luster, the dull brown giving way to healthier copper tones, and though still thin enough to count ribs beneath its hide, its body no longer teetered on the edge of collapse. The bear watched these improvements with what could only be described as satisfaction, her own movements becoming more animated as her adopted charge recovered, as though the fawn's returning vitality somehow restored something vital within herself as well. The bear's behavior changed subtly as the fawn improved. Less gentle nursing of an invalid, more active teaching of a child. She began to demonstrate rather than simply provide, showing through example rather than mere caretaking. She would dig certain roots, then wait expectantly until the fawn investigated the exposed earth with its sensitive nose. She would avoid certain mushrooms or plants with obvious intent, steering the young deer away with her body when curiosity drew it too close to potential dangers. What began as desperate survival, a temporary alliance against death itself, gradually transformed into something remarkable and unprecedented. The bear taught through patient demonstration which berries were safe to consume and which harbored hidden toxins, which mushrooms to avoid despite their tempting appearance, how to find water in hidden seeps when visible streams ran dry. The fawn, with no other option but to trust this unlikely guardian who had saved it from certain death, absorbed these lessons with increasing confidence, its natural intelligence adapting to this most unusual education. Their days fell into a rhythm that defied the natural order, yet developed its own strange harmony. They traveled together through the forest, never straying far from water sources, the bear's imposing presence ensuring no other predator dared approach her adopted charge. She would forage in her omnivorous way, digging for grubs, catching the occasional fish from shallow pools, stripping berries from bushes with surprising delicacy, while the fawn grazed nearby on vegetation appropriate to its herbivore digestive system. Yet despite these different dietary needs, they maintained proximity, each aware of the other's position through constant subtle communication of sounds and scents, each seemingly drawing comfort from the mere fact of the other's presence. At night, they shared the shelter of hollow logs when available, or the protection of dense thickets when more substantial cover couldn't be found. The fawn's natural caution around predators, an instinct as old as the existence of deer themselves, gradually gave way to a tentative trust, then something deeper that, in humans, might be called affection. It would occasionally initiate contact now, pressing its head against the bear's side or playfully dancing around her more ponderous form when energy and high spirits overtook it. The bear, for her part, displayed patience that would have astonished even those humans who study her kind most closely. When the fawn's returning strength manifested in playful bursts of activity, pronking leaps or quick dashes through clearings, she would watch with what appeared to be indulgence, sometimes even participating in modified versions of chase games that always ended with gentle wrestling that never crossed the line into genuine roughness. During these moments, the deep grief that had hollowed her eyes since the loss of her cubs seemed to recede, replaced by something that, while not erasing her loss, perhaps made it more bearable. Word of the strange pair spread through the forest community, through the complex network of observation and avoidance that constitutes wilderness communication. Other animals watched from a distance, some with obvious curiosity, others with what seemed like disbelief at this fundamental violation of natural order. Raccoons chattered among themselves from tree branches, their masked faces registering what might be termed scandalized fascination. A family of otters paused in their riverside play to watch the odd duo pass, their normally bold demeanor subdued by the confusing sight of prey and predator in peaceful companionship. A young male deer, perhaps a year old with his first small antlers beginning to form, observed them for several days from the cover of dense underbrush, his nostrils flaring as he processed the scents of his own kind mixed with that of a feared predator. He seemed torn between approaching the fawn, perhaps driven by species recognition or even familial connection, and maintaining a safe distance from the bear whose protection made such approach impossible. Eventually, caution won out over curiosity, and he disappeared back into the depths of the forest, carrying tales of what he'd witnessed to whatever deer society existed in the deeper woods. Summer arrived in full force, bringing abundant food and easier living for all forest creatures. The canopy thickened to create a green cathedral overhead, dappling the forest floor with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Berries ripened in sun-warmed patches, streams ran clear and cool with mountain snowmelt, and prey species produced new generations that ensured predators wouldn't go hungry. It was a time of plenty that eased the constant pressure of survival, allowing moments of what might almost be called leisure, even among the wild inhabitants of the woodland. The fawn, no longer deserving of that title as it grew into a young deer with lengthening legs and strengthening body, still maintained its unusual bond with the bear despite the changing season and its own increasing maturity. They could be seen in forest clearings during the golden hours of early morning or late afternoon. The bear digging for roots or stripping bark, while the deer grazed nearby on sweet grasses, each aware of the other's position, each seemingly drawing comfort from the proximity that defied all natural expectations. Their communication had evolved into something sophisticated and subtle, a language of postures, sounds, and movements that only they fully understood. The deer could distinguish between the bear's warning rumbles that signaled danger and the contented grunts that indicated all was well. The bear, likewise, seemed to interpret the meaning behind the deer's ear positions, tail flicks, and various snorts or stamps. When danger threatened, a specific head movement from the bear would send the deer to predetermined hiding places without panic or confusion. When separated briefly by the necessities of their different natures, they could locate each other again with quiet calls that carried meaning without attracting unwanted attention. But both creatures, guided by instinct deeper than their unusual connection, sensed change approaching with the first hints of autumn. Subtle shifts in light quality, the occasional early turning leaf drifting down from the canopy, the changing behavior of migratory birds, all signaled the approaching seasonal transition that would transform their world once again. Nature would soon make demands that even their remarkable bond might not withstand, forcing choices neither seemed prepared to make. The bear felt the pull first, the ancient urge to increase food consumption dramatically, to layer fat beneath her fur in preparation for the long winter sleep. Her foraging became more intense, her movements more purposeful, as biological imperatives began to override all other considerations. The deer, too, sensed coming change, its body responding to shortening days with thickening fur and shifting nutritional needs. The forest itself was preparing for transformation, and no creature within it, no matter how unusual their circumstances, could remain untouched by these fundamental rhythms. As summer's abundance began its subtle shift toward autumn's preparation, their unprecedented alliance faced its greatest challenge: the inexorable pull of separate natures and diverging paths that no amount of unlikely affection could permanently overcome. The question that hung between them, unasked but ever present in these changing days, was whether what they had built together could survive the demands of their different destinies. The answer would come with the falling leaves and first frost, when nature would demand conformity to its ancient patterns with a force that brooked no denial, even from two creatures who had already defied its most fundamental laws. The first frost arrived with startling swiftness. One morning, the forest awakened to find every surface transformed. Leaves encased in crystalline sheaths, spider webs reimagined as delicate jewelry. The ground itself crunching underfoot with a sound that announced winter's approach more effectively than any calendar. The bear and deer emerged from their shared shelter beneath a fallen oak to find the world altered, familiar landscapes made strange by this frozen coating. For the bear, this transformation triggered biological imperatives impossible to ignore. Her body, already substantially heavier than in summer months, demanded ever more calories to complete the layer of fat that would sustain her through the coming hibernation. Her foraging became almost frantic, digging for roots and tubers with powerful claws, stripping entire berry bushes in single-minded focus, occasionally even pursuing small game with an intensity she hadn't shown since adopting the fawn. The young deer watched these changes with growing unease. Though still devoted to its unlikely guardian, it sensed the bear's shifting priorities. the way her attention sometimes seemed to look through rather than at her companion, focused on some internal calendar counting down to separation. The deer's own body was changing too. Its summer coat replaced by thicker, grayer fur designed to insulate against cold. Its metabolism adjusting to extract maximum nutrition from increasingly fibrous vegetation as tender growth disappeared. Their wanderings took on new purpose as the bear began leading them gradually upward into the hills, toward the rocky outcroppings where she had denned in previous winters. The journey was unhurried but deliberate, their usual playful interactions diminishing as survival concerns took precedence. Still, each night they slept pressed together, sharing warmth against the increasingly bitter cold. The bear's massive body curled protectively around her smaller companion. As they traveled, they encountered other deer, a small herd preparing for winter in their own way, gathering in larger numbers for protection and companionship during the difficult months ahead. These deer regarded the approaching pair with the now familiar mixture of caution and fascination, maintaining distance but not immediately fleeing as they might from a solitary bear. Among them was the young buck who had observed them during summer, now sporting more substantial antlers and a winter coat that matched the young deer's. Something in this encounter struck a chord in the deer that had been dormant during the months with the bear. The sight of its own kind, moving with the same light-footed grace, communicating through familiar ear flicks and tail positions, awakened something primal and powerful. For the first time since their unlikely alliance began, the deer felt torn between two worlds: the security and connection with its bear protector versus the undeniable pull toward its own species and the life it was born to live. The bear sensed this conflict with an awareness that transcended normal animal perception. She watched as her companion's attention repeatedly drifted toward the distant herd, noted the way it responded to their calls with subtle movements of its own body. That night, as they settled into a temporary shelter beneath a rock overhang, the bear's embrace seemed to hold a new quality. Not just protection, but something that in human terms might be called resignation or even sacrifice. Morning brought heavy snow, the first substantial fall of the season, transforming the landscape into an unbroken expanse of white. The bear rose early, moving with purpose toward a cave she had clearly visited before. The entrance was small but opened into a larger chamber, the floor covered with old leaves and pine needles from previous seasons. It smelled of earth and previous occupancy, a place of safety where generations of bears had waited out winter's fury. The bear spent hours preparing the den, arranging bedding material, ensuring the entrance was partially obscured but not blocked. The deer watched from nearby, understanding on some level that these preparations marked a significant transition. When the work was complete, the bear approached her companion with slow, deliberate movements, pressing her muzzle against the deer's side in a gesture that had become their primary expression of affection. What followed was a display of communication more complex than most humans would believe possible between different species. Through a series of gentle nudges, meaningful glances toward the distant deer herd, and finally, a soft but firm push away from the den, the bear made her intentions clear. It was time for the deer to rejoin its own kind. The young deer resisted initially, pressing back against the bear with stubborn affection, attempting to follow when she retreated toward her den. But the bear remained firm, growing more insistent in her rejection, finally issuing a warning growl unlike any sound she had directed at her companion before. The message could not be clearer. Their paths, which had converged against all natural law, must now diverge again. For long moments, the deer stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, caught between the pull toward the only parent it had known since losing its mother and the distant calls of its own species. The bear watched from her den entrance, her small eyes reflecting a complexity of emotion that defied simple categorization. Then, with a final soft snort that carried farewell more eloquently than words, she turned and disappeared into the darkness of her winter sanctuary. The deer remained frozen for what seemed like hours, its breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Then, as though released from a spell, it turned and bounded through the deep snow, moving with increasing confidence toward the valley where the herd had been spotted. Its path would be its own now, shaped by the remarkable education it had received from its bear guardian, but following the ancient patterns of its own kind. As winter settled fully upon the forest, the bear slept in her den, her massive body conserving energy through the cold months, sustained by the fat reserves built through autumn's intense foraging. Her dreams, if bears dream during their winter dormancy, perhaps contained images of cubs lost and a deer saved, an accounting of grief and redemption that balanced in some cosmic ledger. The deer integrated gradually into the herd, its unusual upbringing evident in subtle behaviors that differentiated it from its peers. It showed less fear of predator scents, employed foraging techniques no deer had taught it, and occasionally gazed toward the higher elevations where a cave contained a sleeping bear who had defied nature itself to save an orphaned fawn. Spring would come again, as it always does, melting snow and awakening dormant life throughout the forest. What that new season might bring for these two creatures, whether their paths might cross again or whether their extraordinary bond was limited to a single year's unlikely alliance, remained written only in the uncertain future, waiting to unfold with the first green buds of another cycle. But in the stories told by forest creatures, in the collective memory of the woodland, their tale would remain, a testament to the possibility that even the most fundamental laws of nature could be transcended by something more powerful. The capacity for unexpected compassion in a world defined by survival. The winter that followed was one of legendary harshness. Old trees throughout the forest cracked with explosive reports as sap froze and expanded within their trunks. Streams vanished beneath ice so thick that even the persistent movement of water couldn't prevent its formation. Snow accumulated in drifts taller than a man, reshaping the landscape into an alien geography of white peaks and valleys that bore little resemblance to the familiar forest terrain. For the deer herd, these conditions transformed survival from routine challenge to desperate struggle. Their normal winter feeding grounds became inaccessible beneath impenetrable snow, forcing them to venture into exposed areas they would typically avoid. The energy expended pawing through crusted snow to reach meager vegetation beneath often exceeded the calories gained from such efforts, creating a mathematical equation that could only end in starvation if conditions persisted. The young deer, no longer a fawn but not yet fully mature, found itself uniquely positioned within this crisis. The survival lessons learned from the bear proved invaluable in ways neither creature could have anticipated during their time together. While other deer focused solely on traditional feeding areas, growing progressively weaker as these sources failed, the bear-raised deer employed different strategies. It led small groups to south-facing slopes, where the bear had shown it how to find exposed vegetation when snow covered easier options. It demonstrated how to strip nutritious inner bark from certain trees, a technique no deer would naturally discover, but which the bear had employed regularly during autumn foraging. Most significantly, it recognized which snow formations likely concealed pockets of air where ground plants might remain accessible with strategic digging rather than exhausting random efforts. These behaviors initially met with resistance from the herd. The older does especially regarded such unorthodox approaches with suspicion, their conservative instincts preferring familiar suffering to untested solutions. But as the winter deepened and traditional methods failed, hunger overcame caution. First, the younger deer, then gradually the entire herd began following the bear-taught strategies that offered their only chance against starvation. The young buck, who had observed the unusual pair during warmer months, became the deer's closest ally in these efforts. Something in his nature, perhaps a similar openness to innovation, or simply greater desperation, made him receptive to approaches other deer initially rejected. Together, they established new feeding patterns that gradually spread throughout the herd, creating a hybrid survival strategy born of traditional deer knowledge enhanced by ursine wisdom, transmitted through their unlikely ambassador. Not all survived the brutal winter. The very old and very young succumbed to the combined assault of cold and hunger, their bodies eventually buried under fresh snowfall or discovered by opportunistic predators. But the core of the herd endured, their survival rate notably higher than other deer groups in surrounding territories. A statistical anomaly that would have fascinated biologists had any been present to observe this natural experiment in cross-species knowledge transfer. For the bear, winter passed in the suspended animation of hibernation. Her metabolism slowed to a fraction of normal function, heart rate reduced to mere beats per minute, respiration so shallow it would be barely perceptible to observation. Yet, hibernation is not true sleep. A level of consciousness remains, fluctuating between deeper and lighter states, particularly as winter progresses toward its inevitable conclusion. In these liminal periods of semi-awareness, the bear's mind processed fragments of memory and sensation. The warm weight of cubs against her side from seasons past. The surprising lightness of a spotted fawn trembling beneath her protective paw. The satisfaction of watching her adopted charge grow stronger under her care. These images flowed through her dormant consciousness like underground streams beneath winter ice. Hidden but essential, sustaining something vital during the long darkness. As February yielded to March, subtle changes penetrated even the insulated sanctuary of the bear's den. The quality of light filtering through partially blocked entrance. The shifting temperature as daytime warming began to outlast nighttime freezing. The distant sounds of ice giving way and water beginning to flow freely again. These sensory cues triggered hormonal changes, gradually accelerating her metabolic rate and preparing her body for emergence. The deer, meanwhile, had survived the worst of winter's assault. Though significantly thinner than autumn weight, it maintained sufficient strength to function effectively, its bear-taught adaptability proving decisive during the season's harshest periods. As the first hints of spring approached, more sensed than observed in tangible changes, it found itself drawn increasingly toward the higher elevations where its unlikely guardian slumbered. This pull wasn't constant, but came in waves of increasing intensity. A restlessness that coincided with warming days. An orientation toward the mountains during quiet moments when immediate survival concerns temporarily receded. The young buck noticed these episodes of distraction, sometimes following at a cautious distance, when the deer made short exploratory journeys upslope before returning to the safety of the herd. The first true thaw arrived suddenly. 3 days of unusually warm temperatures that transformed the forest with startling swiftness. Snow retreated from south-facing slopes, exposing damp earth to sunlight for the first time in months. Streams swelled with meltwater, their surfaces changing from solid to liquid in visible progression. The earliest plants, snowdrops and winter aconite, pushed green shoots through the retreating snow, their appearance signaling definitively that winter's grip was finally loosening. For the bear, these changes penetrated even deep hibernation. Her body responded automatically to the seasonal shift, metabolic rate increasing, heart and respiration accelerating, consciousness rising closer to the surface of awareness. The transition from hibernation is not immediate, but occurs in stages over days or even weeks, a gradual reawakening that prevents shock to systems dormant for months. The deer sensed these changes with an awareness that transcended normal animal perception. Something in its connection to the bear, formed during those crucial months of dependency and protection, created a link that defied conventional understanding. As the bear approached wakefulness, the deer's restlessness intensified, its behavior growing increasingly focused on the upland regions where their paths had diverged before winter's arrival. The decisive moment came with the first substantial rainfall of the new season. A gentle but persistent downpour that accelerated snowmelt and awakened countless dormant organisms throughout the forest ecosystem. The deer separated from the herd during early morning hours, moving with purpose toward higher elevations, its path unerring despite months of separation and landscape transformation by winter's sculpting. The young buck followed at a distance, curiosity overcoming caution as he tracked the deer's deliberate journey upslope. He maintained sufficient separation to avoid detection, but remained close enough to observe whatever destination or purpose motivated this solitary expedition. His own experiences during winter, seeing firsthand how the unusual deer's different knowledge had saved many from starvation, had transformed initial wariness into something approaching reverence for whatever mysterious education had produced such life-saving adaptations. The bear emerged from hibernation that same morning, not fully active, but in the transitional state between winter dormancy and spring revival. She moved slowly to the entrance of her den, blinking in the unfamiliar brightness, her massive body dramatically thinner after months sustained only by stored fat reserves. She sat in the entrance, face lifted to the gentle rain, absorbing sensory information about the changed world, while her body continued its physiological transition to full wakefulness. The deer approached the clearing before the den with caution, born not of fear, but respect for the delicate moment it somehow understood was unfolding. It stopped at the edge of the trees, watching the bear's still form with intense focus, communicating its presence not through sound, but through the deliberate projection of scent carried on the moist air currents flowing upslope. The bear's reaction when that scent reached her was profound. Her head turned with a swiftness that belied her post-hibernation lethargy, small eyes widening, nostrils flaring to confirm what seemed impossible. For long moments, bear and deer regarded each other across the clearing, one emerging from winter's deep sleep, one having fought through winter's harsh reality, both fundamentally changed by the season's passage, yet instantly recognizing the connection that defied natural law. The deer moved first, stepping into the clearing with deliberate slowness, its approach neither fearful nor aggressive, but measured, respectful of the bear's transitional state. The bear remained motionless except for her eyes, which tracked every movement with an intensity that reflected complex emotions no human observer would expect from a predator regarding natural prey. Their reunion unfolded with a choreography no witness would believe possible between different species. The deer approached to a respectful distance, then lowered its head in a gesture unmistakably similar to the greeting it had offered during their shared months. The bear responded by extending her muzzle, drawing in the deer's scent with deep inhalations that seemed to satisfy some essential question. Then, with movement still slowed by hibernation's lingering effects, she rose fully and moved forward to meet her former charge. From his concealed position, the young buck watched with astonishment as bear and deer engaged in what could only be described as joyful recognition. The deer prancing in tight circles around the larger animal, the bear making gentle sounds unlike her normal vocalizations, their bodies eventually coming together in physical contact that should have been terrifying, but instead conveyed unmistakable affection. What followed was even more remarkable. As though picking up a conversation interrupted by winter's intervention, they began moving together through the clearing. The bear demonstrating renewed foraging techniques appropriate to early spring conditions. The deer responding with evident understanding. Their communication flowed through subtle movements, vocalizations, and body language that created a private language between unlikely companions. The young buck remained frozen in his hiding place, witnessing something so far outside natural order that his instinctive fear of predators was temporarily overridden by sheer fascination. When the pair eventually moved deeper into the forest together, he followed at a safer distance, unable to abandon this unprecedented opportunity to observe what appeared to be the continuation of the extraordinary relationship he had glimpsed the previous year. For 3 days, the deer remained with the bear, their activities falling into patterns that suggested established routine rather than new negotiation. They foraged together, rested together, seemed to communicate through methods invisible to outside observation. The bear, still regaining strength after hibernation, benefited from the deer's greater mobility in locating early spring growth. The deer, in turn, gained protection and continued education in survival techniques no other member of its species possessed. The young buck maintained his cautious observation throughout this period, gradually moving closer as his fear diminished in the face of ongoing evidence that this particular bear posed no threat to this particular deer. On the 3rd day, his presence was finally detected, not by any carelessness on his part, but through the bear's recovering senses regaining their legendary acuity. The confrontation that followed tested natural boundaries even further. The bear's initial reaction to a second deer was predictably defensive, her body language shifting toward intimidation as she moved to position herself between the perceived threat and her companion. The familiar deer intervened with surprising assertiveness, placing itself between bear and buck, employing the same communicative techniques that had established their own unlikely bond. What transpired then could only be described as negotiation across species barriers. The familiar deer somehow conveying to the bear that this newcomer represented no threat. The bear gradually relaxing her aggressive posture. The young buck trembling but holding ground in a display of courage that defied every survival instinct encoded in his genetic heritage. By sunset, an unprecedented tableau had formed in the small clearing. A full-grown black bear resting against a fallen log, while 2 deer grazed nearby. All 3 maintaining awareness of each other's positions, but without the tension that should naturally exist between predator and prey. The young buck maintained greater distance than his companion, his body language still conveying appropriate caution, but his presence itself represented a fundamental violation of natural order that paralleled the original relationship that had preceded it. As darkness fell and nocturnal creatures began their activities throughout the surrounding forest, this improbable trio shared a small space illuminated by moonlight filtering through branches just beginning to show the first buds of spring. Their unlikely alliance, formed against all natural expectation, interrupted by winter's necessary separations, now reformed with the possibility of expansion, represented something profound about adaptation, connection, and the potential for unexpected bonds to form, even in a world governed by the harsh mathematics of survival. Spring spread its transformative influence across the forest with increasing momentum, each day bringing new growth, new births, new possibilities. And in one small corner of this awakening ecosystem, boundaries between species continued to dissolve in ways that would reshape understanding of what was possible. when necessity, compassion, and intelligence converged to create something entirely new in the ancient patterns of the wild. April arrived with an explosion of renewal that transformed the forest. Seemingly overnight, the drab palette of winter gave way to vibrant greens as leaves unfurled from sticky buds. Wildflowers carpeted the forest floor in waves of color. First, the white stars of bloodroot and delicate hepatica. Then the nodding yellow bells of trout lilies, followed by purple-blue carpets of violets and the pink blush of spring beauties. The air itself changed, carrying complex perfumes of growth and fertility that signaled opportunity to every creature in the woodland. This abundance created a temporary truce across species lines. Predators found sufficient prey without extreme effort. Herbivores discovered more vegetation than they could possibly consume. The desperate edge of hunger that sharpened winter interactions dulled in spring's plenty, allowing unusual associations to develop with less pressure from immediate survival needs. The bear and her deer companions, now expanded to include the young buck on the periphery of their arrangement, established a routine that defied classification within normal wildlife behavior. They maintained a home territory centered around the bear's den, but ranging widely through the richest foraging areas as they emerged with the advancing season. Their movements followed no established pattern of either species, but instead created a hybrid approach that maximized advantages from both traditions. The original deer, now approaching its second year, its spotted coat long replaced by adult coloration, moved with complete comfort in the bear's presence. The young buck maintained greater caution, but showed increasing relaxation as days passed without the predatory response his instincts continuously anticipated. Most remarkably, the bear herself displayed patience with this arrangement that contradicted her species' typical solitary nature, seeming to derive genuine satisfaction from the continued companionship. Word of this unprecedented alliance spread through forest communication networks with increasing speed. Other deer observed from safe distances, their curiosity evident in prolonged observation periods before inevitable retreat. Smaller predators, foxes and coyotes, altered their hunting patterns to avoid the unusual group. Their caution born not just from the bear's dangerous potential, but from confusion about how to categorize this violation of natural order. The most significant development came in late April when the main deer herd, moving upslope as they followed spring's advancing green line, encountered the trio during early morning grazing. Previous brief interactions had always ended with the herd's retreat to safer distances. This encounter unfolded differently, shaped by the winter's harsh lessons and the survival knowledge that had transferred from the bear-raised deer to its struggling companions during those desperate months. The herd's approach was cautious but deliberate, led by older does whose normal wariness was tempered by recognition of the unusual deer who had introduced life-saving foraging techniques during winter's darkest period. The bear noticed their approach first, her posture shifting to alert but not aggressive, a reaction that itself represented remarkable restraint from a predator confronted with multiple potential prey animals. What followed was a complex negotiation conducted through body language, scent, and vocalizations that created a diplomatic exchange no human observer would believe possible. The bear-raised deer moved between its original guardian and approaching herd, its movements conveying reassurance to both parties. The young buck, who had already navigated this unusual territory, served as secondary intermediary, demonstrating through his relaxed behavior that immediate danger was absent despite the predator's presence. The herd maintained a respectful distance, but did not retreat entirely, creating a new equilibrium where multiple deer grazed within visual range of a predator who made no move toward aggression. This tentative truce expanded the circle of unusual association beyond the original trio to include, at least peripherally, a broader community of woodland creatures navigating a relationship previously thought impossible. May brought new complications to this extraordinary arrangement. The bear, fully recovered from hibernation and responding to seasonal hormones, began displaying behaviors associated with potential mating. She marked territory more frequently, vocalized in ways meant to carry to distant males, and occasionally separated from her deer companions for solitary excursions that likely involved seeking or responding to potential mates. During one such absence, lasting nearly 3 days, a significant shift occurred within the deer social structure. The main herd, growing increasingly comfortable with the established pattern of distant coexistence, moved closer to the territory the unusual trio had established. Without the bear's intimidating presence, natural deer social behaviors reasserted themselves. The bear-raised deer found itself drawn into more typical interactions with its own kind. Mutual grooming, play fighting with other young adults, participation in group vigilance behaviors that had been unnecessary under the bear's protection. The young buck, whose attachment had grown increasingly evident, remained close throughout this transition. His position within normal deer social hierarchy, elevated by his association with the bear-raised deer, whose winter knowledge had proven so valuable. Together, they formed a bridge between conventional deer society and the unprecedented arrangement with the bear, their behavior demonstrating the possibility of maintaining both connections simultaneously. When the bear returned from her solitary journey, she discovered this altered social arrangement with evident confusion. Her initial approach to the now larger deer group triggered predictable flight responses from the newer associates, though notably not from her original companion or the young buck. What followed was another renegotiation of boundaries. The bear-raised deer moving between retreating herd and confused predator. The young buck maintaining intermediate position, gradually re-establishing the unusual detente that had been interrupted. By month's end, a new equilibrium emerged. The bear maintained her territory with the original deer companions at its center, but the arrangement now included peripheral acceptance of the larger herd at greater distances. The bear-raised deer moved freely between these worlds, sometimes remaining close to its ursine guardian during foraging or rest periods, other times joining the conventional deer society for activities natural to its species. The young buck similarly navigated this dual existence, though with greater emphasis on traditional deer interactions as mating instincts began their seasonal influence. June brought the forest to its fullest expression of life. The canopy closed completely, creating a green cathedral effect that filtered sunlight into dappled patterns across the understory. Fawns born weeks earlier began exploring beyond their hiding places, their spotted coats providing camouflage among sun-dappled shadows. Bird nests throughout the forest contained hungry nestlings, their constant demands creating a background chorus of chirping that marked daylight hours. Every ecological niche overflowed with activity as the brief but intense growing season reached maximum productivity. For the bear, this period brought increasing evidence of her successful mating during May's excursions. Subtle changes in behavior, increased appetite, more frequent rest periods, slightly altered scent, suggested embryonic development had begun, though true pregnancy would remain suspended until later in the season, when her body would determine if sufficient fat reserves existed for successful cubs. These physiological changes influenced her interactions with the deer, creating a gentler quality in her movements and greater tolerance for the occasional approach of deer beyond her original companions. For the bear-raised deer, now fully mature, June brought its own biological imperatives. Though younger than typical first breeding for its species, its exceptional physical condition, a result of superior nutrition and reduced stress under the bear's protection, triggered hormonal changes associated with reproduction. Its behavior shifted subtly, with greater attention directed toward the conventional deer herd where potential mates could be found, particularly during evening hours when deer social activities intensified. The young buck, now sporting impressive antlers in velvet that marked his development toward breeding condition, watched these changes with evident confliction. His attachment to the bear-raised deer had developed characteristics beyond normal same-sex deer associations, perhaps influenced by their shared experience as boundary crossers between conventional animal societies. As natural mating instincts intensified with the season, this attachment created visible tension in his behavior. Following when the deer joined the herd for increasingly lengthy periods, yet maintaining connection to the unusual arrangement with the bear that had become integral to his identity. By summer solstice, the longest day marking the technical beginning of summer, though the forest had been in full summer condition for weeks, the unusual social arrangement had developed complexity beyond anything previously documented in wildlife behavior. The core relationship between bear and original deer remained intact, but now existed within a broader network of associations that expanded and contracted according to time of day, individual needs, and shifting biological imperatives. Most remarkable was how this arrangement had begun influencing wider forest dynamics. Other deer herds encountering this group adopted modified flight responses, retreating to safer distances rather than panicking at the bear's presence. Smaller predators developed more complex assessment behaviors around the territory, learning to distinguish between the bear's tolerance of specific deer and her normal predatory response to other potential prey. Even birds altered their alarm call patterns in the vicinity, developing specific vocalizations that appeared to communicate the unusual, but not immediately dangerous presence of this mixed species group. July's heat brought subtle shifts as the forest's explosive growth stabilized into summer patterns. Vegetation reached maximum density, creating distinct microclimates beneath the canopy where temperature and humidity remained relatively constant despite external weather fluctuations. Water became increasingly precious as smaller streams dried completely, concentrating animal activity around permanent water sources where uneasy truces developed out of necessity. For the bear, physiological changes continued as her body prepared for potential cubs, though true gestation remained in suspended animation pending autumn's final assessment of resource adequacy. Her activities increasingly centered around maximizing calorie intake, with longer foraging periods and greater focus on high-energy food sources. Despite these shifts driven by biological imperative, she maintained the extraordinary connection with her deer companions, perhaps recognizing on some level that their association contributed to her success by reducing energy expenditure on territorial defense and improving foraging efficiency through their complementary abilities. For the deer, both the original companion and the young buck who had become inseparable from this arrangement. Summer brought increasing integration with conventional deer society while maintaining their unprecedented relationship with the bear. They developed a pattern of dividing their time between worlds, mornings and midday, with the bear in cooler forest sections, evenings and early night with the deer herd in meadows or forest edges, where social bonds were reinforced through group activities. This dual existence created behavioral adaptations unseen in normal wildlife. The deer developed distinct communication styles depending on their current association, using subtle body language and scent communication with the bear that differed markedly from the more demonstrative interactions employed within deer society. They became translators between worlds, their behavior shifting seamlessly as they moved between these different spheres of existence. By August, as summer's abundance began its imperceptible shift toward autumn preparation, the forest community had largely normalized this extraordinary arrangement. What had begun as a singular act of cross-species adoption, defying every natural law and expectation, had evolved into a complex social structure that influenced an entire ecosystem's functioning. New patterns of interaction, communication, and territorial usage spread outward from the original relationship like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, creating subtle but significant changes throughout the woodland community. Perhaps most profound was how this arrangement demonstrated adaptation's power within natural systems. What began as desperation, a motherless fawn and a childless bear finding unexpected connection through shared loss, had transformed into innovation that provided advantages to all involved. The bear gained assistance in territory monitoring and efficient foraging. The deer received protection and knowledge unavailable within its species' traditional practices. The forest itself benefited from more stable predator-prey dynamics and more efficient resource utilization through their cooperative activities. As summer's heat gradually yielded to autumn's approaching coolness, this unprecedented alliance faced its greatest test. The changing season would bring biological imperatives impossible to ignore. The bear's need for intensive feeding, followed by hibernation, the deer's participation in mating season, and subsequent herd movements to winter territories. Whether their extraordinary bond could survive these powerful natural forces remained uncertain. But what they had already accomplished, creating connection where none should exist, building understanding across species boundaries, demonstrating possibility beyond natural law's apparent limitations, had permanently altered their forest world in ways that would continue influencing its development long after their individual stories concluded. The widening circle of their influence represented something profound about nature's capacity for adaptation and connection, a testament to the possibility that even the most fundamental boundaries might prove permeable when necessity, intelligence, and perhaps something like compassion converge to create new possibilities within the ancient patterns of the wild.